We're talking to Kevin Bales. The date is, what is today?
27th of January?
January 27th, 2006.
Yep.
About 11:10?
Yep.
I don't know. So Kevin, I guess just for someone that doesn't know anything, can you give just maybe a few sentences or even a couple paragraphs of kind of an overview of who you are and what you do?
Oh, okay. I used to be a teacher, but for the last more than 10 years now, all of my work's been about contemporary slavery, modern forms of slavery. And I do research in that area, but I'm also the president of an organization in the United States called Free the Slaves. And I moved from Great Britain to America about 5 years ago in order to establish Free the Slaves as the sister organization for Anti-Slavery International. And I sit on the board of Anti-Slavery, but the key thing to know about Anti-Slavery International is that it's the original and the oldest human rights organization in the world. It was set up in 1787. So really what we do in the United States today in Free the Slaves is continue the anti-slavery movement that was started in 1787 and do our best to find out the right kind of information, help people understand about contemporary slavery. We work with governments to do that. We try to get slavery out of the products that we use. We want to go to slave-free trade. And then in many ways the most important thing that we do is that we work with groups overseas to get people out of slavery and help them to achieve normal lives as autonomous citizens.
Okay. So you say slavery. So most people understand that slavery has been abolished.
Well, you know, legal slavery's been abolished, but slavery wasn't abolished. I mean, that's a little bit like saying, you know, Moses came down with the 10 Commandments and everybody stopped lying and cheating. Well, no, sorry, you know, because there's a law against it doesn't mean that it all stopped. And in fact, today we have probably more slaves in the world than ever before in human history. Our best estimate is about 27 million people in slavery today. That's twice the number that were taken out of Africa in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. So we've got a lot of people in slavery. That's the bad news. But there is good news in that we now are beginning to understand ways to bring it to an end and to bring people to freedom. And I should be absolutely clear. This is real slavery. I'm not talking about sweatshops. I'm not talking about slaves to shopping, slaves to chocolate. I'm not talking about a bad marriage. I'm talking about somebody who can't walk away, who is trapped, whose free will has been taken from them, who's then being used by someone to make a profit and is being paid absolutely nothing. They cannot walk away. This is real slavery. It's not legal, but slavery existed before they ever invented legal systems. I mean, slavery existed before they ever wrote down the very first law 5,000 years ago. It's not legal, but it's still slavery.
So this number 27 million, that's pretty astonishing. How do you guys come up with that figure?
Well, we worked for a number of years, in fact, to collect information from all over the planet Earth. United Nations, Interpol, governments, newspapers, journalists, you name it. We built a huge database of every single country in the world. We tried to talk to the most authoritative and reliable sources in every country to get how many people were in slavery in each country and how many people were flowing back and forth between countries as victims of human trafficking. We showed that to experts and said, what do you think about these numbers? Do these numbers work for you? And when, at the end of the day, when we adjusted and tried to make sure we had the closest thing to the truth, the number we arrived at was 27 million. Now that number we actually arrived at like 6 years ago, but last year in 2005, the United Nations spent a lot of money to basically do the same exercise all over again to figure out how many people there were in slavery around the world, and they came up with about 27 million. So we're beginning to feel like, yep, the number's about right for the planet Earth, 27 million people in slavery. Okay,
can you give me an idea of some of the most troubled spots and troubled areas where slavery occurs?
Sure. Slavery isn't restricted to any country. It's not restricted to any region of the world. Most slaves live in the developing world, in the poorest parts of the world, because the poorest people are the ones who are most vulnerable to enslavement. But there's slavery in every virtually every single country in the world. In the countries that have the largest amounts of slaves are actually the countries that also have an awful lot of people as well. So India, for example, we think may have between 8 and 10 million people in slavery. But remember, this is a country of 1 billion people. But it also has a long history of what's called traditional debt bondage, which is a kind of slavery that passes down from generation to generation. Total control, use for profit, violent use and abuse of the people in slavery. Maybe 10 million in India, large numbers across South Asia, in Thailand, in Pakistan, across North Africa and in the Arab regions of down the coasts of West Africa. There are very significant numbers of children who have been trafficked into slavery. Lots of slaves, sadly, in Brazil and some of the other South American countries. But slaves in the United States, slaves in all the Western European countries. In the United States, we're of course estimating, but maybe 30 to 50,000 people in slavery in the United States today is our best guess, and we have a number of ways that we calculate that, but that would probably be a conservative. Certainly 30,000 would be a conservative estimate of how many people are in slavery in America today.
So can you give me some examples of how one might find themselves in that situation as a slave?
Well, you know,
I'm going to sit down here.
Oh, sure.
Continue looking at the camera.
Okay. Okay.
You're talking to the audience here, not
Okay.
me.
I mean, slave catching today is not about knocking people over the head or kidnapping them, usually. That sometimes happens, but for the most part, you don't have to knock someone over the head and kidnap them to make them a slave today, because people become slaves because they're vulnerable and they're desperate for work. And so you go to that 1 billion people around the world who live on less than $1 a day or around $1 a day. And those people are hungry, they can't take care of their kids well enough, they're worried about their own health and housing and so forth. So when somebody drives into the place that they live, drives a truck in and stands up in the back of that truck and says, anybody want work? Anybody want a job? You know, the desperation brings people to jump into the back of that truck. I mean, I've talked to people who have said, you know, that man, he stood there and said, I want to offer you jobs. And they said, he's dicey. That man is dubious. He looks like he could be a scam artist. But my kids are hungry, and my wife's sick, and we don't have a roof over our heads. So they say, I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to go off, try to earn some money. They get in the back of the truck. They're taken 50 miles away, they're put to work on a farm, whatever. They're kept there working for a while. About the time that the person realizes, hey, we're not getting paid, and in fact these working conditions are much worse than we were told, about the time they say, I think I'm going to leave, this is crazy, that's the time when the guns come out. And the people say, well, actually you're not leaving, and you're not getting paid, and you work here, and you belong to us, and if you try to leave, we kill you. So people walk into slavery today, for the most part. They walk into slavery because they're desperate and because of trickery of people who can take them into slavery. That's the way a lot of people come to slavery today. A lot of people, though, as well in the world are born into slavery. In countries like Mauritania or in the Sudan, in India and Pakistan, have millions of people who were slaves from the minute they were born, as were their parents, as were their grandparents, as were their great-grandparents. And, of course, the big question for us is, are we going to let their kids be slaves?
So what is some of the products, or whether it's the products that they're making, or well, actually we'll go into the sexual slavery a little bit later, but particularly as far as the economics is concerned, can we go into some of the products that are being made, and then following that, some of the corporations that that produce those products, and what is their response?
Yeah. Sadly, the slavery that occurs in the developing world touches every one of us, because raw materials and commodities and some individual products flow from the hands of slaves into our lives and into our homes. Everything from tea and chocolate, cocoa, sugar, coffee, cotton. You know, the shirt that I've got on Probably has threads of slave cotton woven through it, just like the shirt that you're wearing right now, as well as some finished goods, jewelry and fireworks and rugs and bangles and sandals. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff being made by slaves around the world that are flowing into our homes, into our economies. That said, I got to tell you, it's also a little tricky because we, as consumers, as Western consumers, want to be able to say, "Oh, that's a bad company. These guys in this big company, they're bad. I want to nail these guys and make a boycott." But that doesn't work for slavery. And the reason why it doesn't work is because slave owners, slave holders around the world are not in the majority. There's no country in the world like America in the 1850s where everybody who makes cotton has slaves. Indeed, slave owners around the world today are just a tiny, tiny fraction of local economies, a tiny fraction of national economies. And we have to be really careful whenever we talk about boycotts that if we stop buying chocolate or we stop buying cotton or whatever, that in an attempt to hurt the slaveholder, we don't actually cause terrible harm to the 99 other families in that area who don't use slaves, who are just farm families who need to be able to make a living. We have to look very carefully about that. That's not to say that companies don't need to do a better job about this. You can make the argument, if you run a business, that anything that happens in a foreign country is not your business. You can say, you know, I'm selling stuff in the United States, and you know, if the country of Ghana or the country of the Ivory Coast or the country of India can't enforce their own laws against slavery, that's not my problem. My problem is to buy the cheapest goods that I can get and sell them at the right price for my buyers here in the United States. But of course, that's a legal dodge, and it avoids the moral responsibility that all of us have to say, we don't want to live in a world with slavery. We don't want to have slavery touching our lives. And what we have to ask of corporations and businesses is that they think through, where do their products come from? Who might be abused to make the raw materials that flow into their products? And what they can do, not to be policemen, not to be foreign governments, but to be responsible members of a global community and say, what can we do to try to safeguard the people who actually make the products that use them commodities that we end up selling to our customers? How can we actually fulfill our moral responsibility not to dirty our hands with slave-made goods as we pass them on to consumers who may not even understand that they're buying slavery? Now that can be done. And in fact, in the United States, the chocolate industry has stepped up to the plate and has said, we can't be the police, we can't be the foreign government, but we can bankroll, pay for a lot of programs that will help people who are in slavery in chocolate growing regions. And they're shifting millions of dollars from the chocolate industry into work against slavery in the chocolate growing regions. Is it every dollar that's needed? No, it needs to be increased. Do they need to do it with a little more enthusiasm? Yes, they do. But at least they're doing it, and they're showing the way to the clothing makers who are using slave cotton, the grocery stores that are selling slave coffee and tea and sugar, the people who are selling rugs around the country that have been made by little slave children like that. All of those people can do exactly the same thing and say, yeah, if I'm going to make a profit from this, if I'm going to feed my children from the profits I make from this commodity or product, I really shouldn't be doing it when I know it's stained with the blood of children who are in slavery.
So are there any programs set up to assist businesses that want to ensure that their products don't have slavery within their production?
Certainly Free the Slaves does its best to work with any company that wants to come to us and say, how can we get slavery out of our product? And we will work with them to figure out a way to move forward on that. It's not always easy, because a lot of products from around the world are coming from rural areas in undeveloped regions like cocoa and coffee and tea and sugar that come from way out in the boondocks, and it's hard to reach all the way to those rural areas. But it can be done, and it may take a little while, but it can be done. And there are ways to do it. I mean, we understand this. You know, another one has to do with our cell phones. You know, everybody's got a cell phone, and inside our cell phone, one of the key minerals is something called tantalum or coltan. That mineral that we can't have cell phones without that mineral being used to make the circuits is often mined by people who are enslaved by armed militia gangs in the Congo, in Central Africa. Now, at the moment, everybody's got one of these, but nobody understands that we've got this little bit of slavery that we're talking into every time we talk to the people we like and even the people we don't like. And we need to help the cell phone companies, the providers of the services, as well as the people who make these, to understand that we'd really like them to think through, what do we do about these cell phones that have that little bit of slavery in them? Mine actually says free the slaves on it, but that's just because that's the job I do.
So what would you say to, I know I've talked to several businesses here locally that one of them, this guy that I know just is starting a chocolate company, and I've asked him about this, and then I've also talked to several coffee shops that don't carry the fair trade label, and or the certified, buying certified fair trade chocolate. However, they tell me, having to take their word on this, they tell me that they personally go down and know the people that they're getting the
coffee from,
the coffee and or chocolate from.
Well, this is like Guatemalan chocolate or something.
Yeah, the chocolate guy is, I think he gets his stuff from somewhere in Latin America. I can't remember where.
Yeah. Probably Guatemala.
So does he have a further responsibility? I mean, because I think the consumer plays a role here as well. Like, how is the consumer supposed to know, like, that it's fair trade? Like, actually know for sure that this is, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, clearly, what we can all do to help farmers who are having problems in the developing world is to buy fair trade. That's crucially important. If you buy fair trade goods, coffee, sugar, chocolate, you name it, clothing, you're not buying slavery. If it's fair trade, it's not going to be slavery. And usually if you buy goods that are certified as organic, that is almost absolutely unlikely to have slavery within that product. The difficulty, though, is that at the moment, and this is one of the reasons why we need to support fair trade, at the moment, if everybody in America decided they were only going to eat fair trade chocolate, there would be about enough cocoa to go around that's fair trade for each of us to get like one little tiny bite of chocolate a year. There's just not enough fair trade cocoa on the global market because enough of us aren't buying it. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. The more we buy fair trade, the more they're going to make fair trade, the more cocoa will be certified as fair trade, which means there'll be more to buy for the rest of us, and we can grow and grow and grow the system. Buy fair trade, and you can begin to make that difference. But that, doesn't mean we can't. We've got to move down the other path as well, so that a company, huge chocolate companies like Hershey's or Mars, would use up all the fair trade cocoa in the world just on one little product line. Just the Snickers would take up all the cocoa in the world as fair trade. We've got to be able to work with all the other cocoa and say, where's this coming from? How does it get made? How can we make sure this doesn't have child labor, slave labor, abusive labor, and dangerous labor in it as well? And that means talking not just to your local shops, but talking to the companies as well.
So on an economic side of it, what would you say to the shop owners that say, well, I just can't compete? The extra cost of having it certified fair trade, I just can't do it.
Well, that's a tough,
because I can't compete with the people that are buying. Obviously the slave-made chocolate is, you're probably going to get a little bit better deal on it.
Well, you might do.
You may or may not.
I mean, the reality is that slave-made cocoa is no cheaper than normal cocoa, because slave-made cocoa is only a tiny fraction of the world's cocoa supply, and it gets blended into the world's cocoa supply. So you don't know when you're buying a ton of cocoa on the New York cocoa market whether you've got how much slavery is in it. A little bit, a lot, none at all. You just don't know. It all operates to the global market that sets the global price for cocoa. Now, in fact, that's one of the reasons why it's so profitable to be a slaveholder around the world and grow cocoa or cotton or whatever, because the slaveholder the slave farmer, slave-using farmer, gets the market price. They get the same price as their neighbor who doesn't use slaves. But the slave-using farmer is getting the market price, but with a much reduced labor cost. So he's making 50% profit, whereas his neighbor who uses free labor is only making 10% profit. But see, that also takes you back to another kind of challenge, which is that if you boycott that cocoa or that cotton or that coffee, the person you hurt most is the person who uses free labor, because they've only made 10% profit. They don't have as much money in the bank. They don't have as much resource to fall back on. And the person who's used slavery can weather a boycott more easily. I know it's a challenge. It's a tricky one, because I don't want to use slavery in my life. I don't want to have slave-made goods in my life. And my knee-jerk reaction is to say, well, let's boycott them. Let's just get them the hell out of here. But in fact, if you do that, it can rebound and hurt poor, honest, free labor all over the developing world. And sometimes, economic boycotts in the North, we forget how powerful those can be in the South, and how whole governments have collapsed, whole regions have descended into civil war as a result of the disruption to economies that aren't dependent on a whole range of products, but are highly dependent on a single commodity like sugar or a single commodity like cotton. That if that's stopped, the whole place goes down the toilet. Now, I want to stop slavery, but I don't want to do it by throwing honest families into the street and letting them starve. I mean, that's not the way to go about it. It's harder for that reason. And it's harder then for the person who's trying to run a business in the United States to say, well, I've got to compete with people who don't care about this stuff. And to them I have to say, I understand that problem. And that's all about customer education. I mean, people don't want to buy slavery. They want to buy decent stuff. And if they can afford it, they will. And for most of these differences, you know, between certified organic, certified free trade, fair trade, the difference is only 2 or 3%. I think all of us could trim a little bit from your budget here to make up the difference there, to make sure we buy fair trade.
And that's from a consumer end, you know, convincing consumers that they're willing to pay extra. Although I know, like, Starbucks carries fair trade coffee. You know, it's in the back with a bunch of dust on it.
Yeah.
But you know, they probably spend more money on their little brochures that they put out about fair trade coffee than they actually do on the coffee itself. Yeah. Of course, I have a suspicion that not too many people are going into Starbucks saying, "Oh yeah, can I get the fair trade coffee?" Which I think is a problem.
In some ways, in America, you know, Starbucks may have just done some window dressing in terms of putting up fair trade coffee, but at least they've got fair trade coffee, so let's give them that. To my mind, the more serious offender is Walmart, because in the world of slavery and forced labor, the big question mark, one of the big question marks, has to do with exactly how many slaves are being held by the government of China. Now, I know that sounds odd to say the government of China is holding slaves, but in China, if you cross somebody, if you've got the wrong attitude, if you want to belong to the wrong religion, if you talk up in the wrong situation, if you put a little button on one day that says, "I like freedom," you can be arrested and sent to prison for 20 years. No due process, no trial, no chance to defend yourself, no habeas corpus. You're in the joint, and you're in the joint for 20 years, except Chinese government prisons are not prisons like they used to be. They're factories. They're factories that make toasters and lamps and toys and lawnmowers and you name it. And those goods are sold directly to the export to the United States. Now, why do I point at Walmart? I point at Walmart because Walmart is the only American company that doesn't buy from wholesalers in China or Hong Kong who actually have direct contracts with prison factories in China. They go to the prison factory, they know they're buying from a prison factory, they know that the people in that factory, that prison, may well be there, are probably there, not because they're criminals, but because they had the wrong idea or the wrong notion. They're not there because of due process or any sense of justice. They've been locked up to be a slave labor force to support the government of China that makes billions of dollars off us by having slaves work in factories that are disguised as prisons, or prisons that are disguised as factories, and sell directly to chains like Walmart, so that we can walk into a Walmart and say, how on earth can they sell a whole lamp for $1.32, right? Well, the answer is slave labor makes that possible. And, you know, until we face up to the fact that our biggest retailer is in fact in violation of the Smoot-Hawley tariff laws, in violation of the federal laws that say no slave-made goods, no prison-made goods are allowed to be imported into the United States. That law has been on the books since the 1930s. And we enforce that law. Well, we're just going to keep swimming in a sea of cheap products, cheap because slave labor was used to make them.
So I assume you've heard the term Lao Guy.
Oh yeah.
Labor reform.
Yeah.
It's a topic that I don't know a lot about, but there's a guy named Harry Wu.
Sure.
That has spoken a lot about that. So let me just step back a little bit. Then let me. Can you tell me a little bit about personally why did you get involved with this? What was it? What was the spark that made you decide to devote your life to this topic?
Well, there was a spark, but I don't know if it made me decide to devote my life at that moment. I had worked in human rights before. Before I left the United States for about 20 years. But before I left the United States, I worked in anti-death penalty work, and I worked in prisons down in Alabama and Mississippi and places like that. Then I was an academic. And then one day I picked up a leaflet from Anti-Slavery International, and it said, there's millions of people in slavery in the world today. And I thought, what? This was in the 90s, 1990s, and I thought, that can't be right. What? I mean, how come I don't know about that? I'm supposed to be a human rights guy. I'm supposed to know about this stuff. I didn't know. I'm reading this leaflet and I'm thinking, this is crazy. Slaves all over the place. And it really got my curiosity going. I was thinking, I need to dig into this. If there's really a lot of slavery, I need to find out. And the more I dug, the more I discovered nobody seems to know. Every more, I kept unpacking stuff, and then I'd get inside the box, and the box would be empty. It was very, very challenging, very intriguing, and very mysterious in a way. And because my work had been in research, I began to use my research skills and contacts to begin to dig that subject deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's when I began to do things like calculate how many slaves are in the world and find out who's doing what, and where the laws come from, and what's going on. Every day I worked on it. I got a little more into it. Every day I moved toward it. It moved toward me. Every day my heart twisted a little closer to that issue. And then when I began to go out and do research and meet people in slavery in Thailand or India or Pakistan or Brazil or West Africa, and understand through their voices and their eyes what slavery is really about, well, that fixed it. I couldn't go back. I couldn't go back and say, well, that's an interesting time now. I'll go back to being a teacher. No. I mean, once you've met people in slavery and you understand what their lives are like, you've got to do something. That's great. I mean, I feel lucky to be able to do it, and I feel lucky to also have watched over the last 10 years this growth of what in human history is actually the fourth great anti-slavery movement. There was one that started in the 1780s. There was another one that came in America that led to our Civil War and abolition. There was another one in the late 19th century that was all about slavery in Africa. This is the fourth big movement, and we're just at the beginnings of it, but it's starting to pop up everywhere. And the important thing about this fourth great anti-slavery movement is that this could be the one that, instead of making it illegal or making it, within a system of intergovernmental control, could be the movement that brings it actually to an end. They could say, we're going to find everybody in slavery, and we're going to find a way to bring them out of slavery and into productive, autonomous lives and freedom. That can happen. It's not even that expensive. It's about the cost of probably an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier, the price tag on an aircraft carrier would definitely cover the price of probably completely ending slavery in the world.
Wow. So can you tell me, get on like on a personal level, not necessarily for you necessarily, but tell me a story about an individual that you've encountered in your research and your studies on this subject that that you found really moving?
Boy, there's so many slaves that I've met who have really moved me. And some have made me cry, and some have made me sort of want to cheer. Let me tell you about Ramphal. Ramphal is a slightly funny name, I appreciate, but it's a name in India. Ramphal was a guy whose parents were slaves. He was a slave, his parents were slaves, his grandparents were slaves, his great-grandparents were slaves. And before that, he doesn't know. He assumes they were all slaves. He was working in a quarry in India. Started work at like age 3, 4, because his parents were slaves. Literally just breaking rocks with hammers, hauling sand in bags on his back as a 3 and 4-year-old, making sand from rocks with a hammer. I mean, only with slave labor could you make something as ubiquitous as sand by hand, by smashing rocks. But Ramphal was a guy who told me that, you know, before he learned about that freedom was actually possible, because he, you know, his parents and grandparents were slaves. He lived in a village where everybody was a slave. The slaveholders kept them isolated. This was in Uttar Pradesh in India. And he said, you know, before I found out, I thought that was the world. I thought, yeah, of course, if I want to walk or talk or be with someone or leave my house or go back into my house or go to get some water, I have to ask permission. He had no idea about what freedom was about. It's hard for us who grow up in freedom to understand what it means to have no idea of freedom. No idea of freedom. He lived in a world where there was no freedom. And he just assumed that was the world for most people. Until one of our partners in India, a representative of a group called Sankalp, came to his village on the quiet, kind of slipped in at night, and began to talk and say, you know, there's another way to live. There's another way to be. There's a possibility, if you want to work on it, that we can help you form a group that will begin to organize you, and you'll be able to stand up to the slaveholders and maybe even achieve freedom. And Ramphal told me he had to think about that for weeks. The idea was just too strange. And as strange as somebody coming to us and saying, you know, you can fly if you just really work on it. You can just kind of fly if you really think about it. I mean, the idea to be of freedom was as strange to him as that. But he thought, I'm taking a chance. Because he had a little kid, and he thought, what if it were possible to get that little kid out of slavery? Now, they formed a group, they organized, they began to find out about their rights. Finally, they stood up to the slaveholders. And when that happens, every time that slaves come out of slavery into freedom, there's a moment when there's a crisis of violence and anger because the slaveholders are trying to drag them back. And that happened there. Their village was burnt to the ground. Children died in that fire. People were very injured. One of the contractors, one of the slaveholders, was killed by a rock that hit him in the head. It was a horrible situation. A bunch of the ex-slaves now were arrested and put in prison on trumped-up charges by the slave, including Ramphal. And his kids went hungry. Other children died of hunger after coming out of slavery because their village was knocked down and they were denied any chance to work. But they kept building, they kept working together, and they ended up, finally, with the help of this agency, getting their own quarry. Now, they'd been quarry workers as slaves, but so they knew how to run a quarry. They ran their own quarry. All of a sudden, income. All of a sudden, they're able to build their own village. All of a sudden, they build a school. In fact, the first thing they do is build a school and take all the kids out of the workplace. And now you've got a guy like Ramphal who says, you know, I'm still working in a quarry, and it's really boring and awful work, but and the important thing is, I'm not going to do it forever. I've got a dream about a business, about doing some other things. And as soon as I save up enough money, I'm going to make that happen. As soon as I make sure that my kids have got enough clothes and food, I'm going to save up money. I'm going to make my dream happen. Well, I watched him and his whole village do that. And then we watched the next village do that, because Ramphal went to the next village and began to talk to them just because he thought it was the right thing to do. I see that spreading, that freedom spreading like a virus. across some kind of good virus across northern India. I see it doing the same in Ghana and in Pakistan and other places. We can make that freedom virus spread out across these slave-holding communities and make it stop. And that's a story of a man like Ramphal, a young guy, he's probably 23 now, that gives me a lot of hope.
And you said some of the other stories broke your heart.
Oh yeah.
Can you tell me one of those? I know none of those don't dwell on the negative, but also want to shed some light on it, on the fact that not all the stories are as uplifting as that.
Well, there are a lot of slaves that, and it breaks my heart to think about it and to know it, because it's something we have to know every day, is that, with 27 million slaves in the world today, there are millions of slaves who are going to die before they can be freed. And they're going to die young, and they're going to die in horrible ways before we can get to them. And I'm thinking about slaves, for example, that I've met in Thailand. Teenage girls who have been tricked or sold or kidnapped and forced into brothels, not for sex tourists, not for Westerners or Europeans, but just for regular Thai working class guys who want to go and have sex and pay very little money for it, where they're locked in, beaten, raped, assaulted, fed very little, and sometimes murdered as an example to the other girls if they get uppity or try to escape. Those girls will only last about 3 years in that situation. One that I knew, one girl that I talked to, one young woman that I talked to there several years ago named Siri, had been put in the brothel at the age of 14. She'd been gang raped to get her into the work. She was basically then serially raped every day. She had no control over whether or not her customers used condoms or used any kind of controls. She had no access to medicines. She was a cocktail of sexually transmitted diseases. She was brutalized and beaten. She had been whipped with wires. And I'm all but certain, I don't know for certain, but I'm all but certain that she's dead now. By the time 2 or 3 years has passed in those brothels, the girls will test positive for HIV. And when they test positive for HIV, they're just dumped. They're completely disposable. They're thrown out. And some make it home to die. Some die on the streets. Some make it to some kind of agency or temple or something to help them in their last years. They don't have access to life-extending drugs for HIV. And they've been used up. An enormous profit has been made on them. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars have been made on their bodies by the people who own the brothels. And then they're just thrown away like an empty coffee cup.
So I want to shift the topic to the topic of apathy. Mm-hmm. With the work that I do, one of the biggest things that I'm fighting against is just getting people to care enough to actually do something about it. And I think that in America, apathy is I think it's, well, personally, I think it's there's no excuse for it, considering all that we have in this country. For very little effort. In other countries, people fight for human rights and actually risk their lives. Where in this country, you can speak out and you can do a lot of things without any bodily harm coming to you. Sure. What are your thoughts on that? And as far as people say, I just can't deal with thinking about this stuff, and just all sorts of different things. What can I do about it? Who am I? There's just a whole slew of things that people say when you
Excuses,
confront them with this sort of reality.
It's not hard to kind of back away from big ugly problems. There's a lot of big ugly problems, and one of the wonderful things about the fact that we've got television and the web and all that kind of stuff is that we can know what's going on around the world. But one of the tough things about it is it also tells us about so many problems that it's kind of overwhelming about which one do you start with. But I got to tell you that I don't think there is any violation of human dignity more obvious, more simple, and more profound, and also more fixable than modern slavery. And, you know, I appreciate that we all have distractions, and there's a lot of things that we can't deal with, but we don't have to deal with it in a huge way. The reality is that if we all, I did a calculation a couple of months ago about how much money do we need to bring most of the people out of slavery, and it came out to about $900-something million. Now that's a hell of a lot of money, except it's $2.86 per American citizen. $2.86. It's a tenth of what the city of Boston spent to put the tunnel they just put under their river so their highways would go a little faster. Right? It's nothing compared to what Denver's going to spend on its bond issue to pay for the new art museum. Right? It's a drop in the ocean, and we don't have to do a lot. That's you know, people do a lot, but we don't have to do a lot if everybody does just a little bit. If we say, there's a few things I can stand, and then there's a few things that I can't stand. And one of the things I can't stand is to live in a world with slavery. I don't want to live in a world with slavery. I don't want to live in a world with slavery. And if once we make that decision, I don't want to live in a world with slavery, then we can say, I can't sell my house and give all the money, but I could give $10. And before you know it, if everybody's doing that, things will begin to change a lot. It's like all the little raindrops. To get all kind of hokey and philosophical about it. But the other thing is, you know, for me, what am I going to show when I'm dead, right? I mean, a house, a car, a job where I sold stuff. Now that's important. People need to buy stuff and like that.
You can't take it with you.
But you know, I want to be able to say at the end of the day, if life was like some kind of equation, I don't want to be a zero in that equation. And I definitely don't want to be a negative number and make things worse. I want to be some kind of positive number so that when the world stops existing for me, it's not left in worse shape than it was when I got here, because of me, anyway. But, you know, it's not just that. Slavery's that kind of thing that, wouldn't it be cool to give your kids or give your grandkids a world that didn't have slavery? Wouldn't it be amazing that if, you know, the generation before mine gave us the UN, but it also gave us the nuclear weapons, right? It gave us World War II and like that. I would love it. You know, and then there's been other generations. They've given us some great stuff, like rock and roll, but some of them also gave us like genocide, right? I'd like this generation to be the one that says, well, our legacy is going to be no more slavery. And it's doable. That, you know, that in itself would be worth, in a sense, a lot, I think, to almost any person to say, what did I do when I was alive? Well, I helped slavery come to an end forever on this planet. And that's not bad. That'd be worth, you know, putting there on the tombstone or something.
I assume you've heard the quote that's actually on Horace Mann's tombstone. You know Horace Mann?
Yes.
It's be ashamed to die until you've won some victory for humanity. That's on his tombstone.
That's cool.
And I think that's what it comes down to. People like you and I. Not that I put me in your class.
No. You are. Of course.
But just people that want to actually make. They don't want to leave this world.
Yeah.
They want to have made a difference. One of the things that I always tell people that feel discouraged about it is, you're not going to win this victory. This is a huge battle. People have been fighting it as long as human beings have been alive. But here's the thing: like there's been times where things were worse and times when things were better. There's ebbs and flows of human history. And I tell people, like, take all the human rights activists out of the picture for the past 5 years. Just the past 5 years. Instead of doing human rights work, they decided to just get a corporate job or whatever and pursue other their own personal interests. Which, well, I mean, it is my personal interest, but think about what the world would be like.
Yeah.
And then I say, well, what if that number were doubled? What would the world be like? So that's my little analogy.
That's nice. I should get down. Because we're just past.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think they're going to be waiting for me down there.
Okay. Well, I thank you for sitting down.
Oh gosh, how many people were in slavery in each country, and how many people were flowing back and forth between countries as victims of human trafficking? We showed that to experts and said, "What do you think about these numbers? Do these numbers work for you?" And when at the end of the day, when we adjusted and tried to make sure we had the closest thing to the truth, the number we arrived at was 27 million. Now that number we actually arrived at like 6 years ago, but last year in 2005, the United Nations spent a lot of money to basically do the same exercise all over again to figure out how many people there were in slavery around the world, and they came up with about 27 million. So we're beginning to feel like, yep, the number's about right for the planet Earth, 27 million people in slavery.
Okay, can you give me an idea of some of the most troubled spots and troubled areas where slavery occurs?
Sure. Slavery isn't restricted to any country. It's not restricted to any region of the world. Most slaves live in the developing world, in the poorest parts of the world, because the poorest people are the ones who are most vulnerable to enslavement. But there's slavery in virtually every single country, in that we now are beginning to understand ways to bring it to an end and to bring people to freedom. And I should be absolutely clear, this is real slavery. I'm not talking about sweatshops, I'm not talking about slaves to shopping, slaves to chocolate, I'm not talking about a bad marriage, I'm talking about somebody who can't walk away, who is trapped, whose free will has been taken from them, who's then being used by someone to make a profit and is being paid absolutely nothing. They cannot walk away. This is real slavery. It's not legal, but slavery existed before they ever invented legal systems. I mean, slavery existed before they ever wrote down the very first law 5,000 years ago. It's not legal, but it's still slavery.
So this number 27 million, that's pretty astonishing. How do you guys come up with that figure?
Well, we worked for a number of years, in fact, to collect information from all over the planet Earth. United Nations, Interpol, governments, newspapers, journalists, you name it. We built a huge database of every single country in the world. We tried to talk to the most authoritative and reliable sources in every country to get how many, do our best to find out the right kind of information, help people understand about contemporary slavery. We work with governments to do that. We try to get slavery out of the products that we use. We want to go to slave-free trade. And then, in many ways, the most important thing that we do is that we work with groups overseas to get people out of slavery and help them to achieve normal lives as autonomous citizens.
Okay. So you say slavery. So most people understand that slavery has been abolished.
Well, you know, legal slavery's been abolished, but slavery wasn't abolished. I mean, that's a little bit like saying, you know, Moses came down with the 10 Commandments and everybody stopped lying and cheating. Well, no, sorry, you know, because there's a law against it doesn't mean that it all stopped. And in fact, today we have probably more slaves in the world than ever before in human history. Our best estimate is about 27 million people in slavery today. That's twice the number that were taken out of Africa in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. So we've got a lot of people in slavery. That's the bad news. But there is good news.
We're talking to Kevin Bales. The date is, what is today?
27th of January?
January 27th, 2006.
Yep.
About 11:10.
Yep.
I don't know. So Kevin, I guess just for someone that doesn't know anything, can you give just maybe a few sentences or even a couple paragraphs of kind of an overview of who you are and what you do?
Oh, okay. I used to be a teacher, but for the last more than 10 years now, all of my work's been about contemporary slavery, modern forms of slavery. And I do research in that area, but I'm also the president of an organization in the United States called Free the Slaves. And I moved from Great Britain to America about 5 years ago in order to establish Free the Slaves as the sister organization for Anti-Slavery International. And I sit on the board of Anti-Slavery, but the key thing to know about Anti-Slavery International is that it's the original and the oldest human rights organization in the world. It was set up in 1787. So really what we do in the United States today and Free the Slaves is continue the anti-slavery movement that was started in 1787 and in the world. In the countries that have the largest amounts of slaves are actually the countries that also have an awful lot of people as well. So India, for example, we think may have between 8 and 10 million people in slavery. But remember, this is a country of 1 billion people. But it also has a long history of what's called traditional debt bondage, which is a kind of slavery that passes down from generation to generation. Total control, use for profit, violent use and abuse of the people in slavery. Maybe 10 million in India, large numbers across South Asia, in Thailand, in Pakistan, across North Africa and in the Arab regions down the coasts of West Africa. There are very significant numbers of children who have been trafficked into slavery. Lots of slaves, sadly, in Brazil and some of the other South American countries. But slaves in the United States, slaves in all the Western European countries. In the United States, we're of course estimating, but maybe 30 to 50,000 people in slavery in the United States today is our best guess, and we have a number of ways that we calculate that, but that would